Hello, I'm Malcolm Cox, and this is your Tuesday teaching tip. These are tips for helping us to prepare a Bible lesson, a devotional, or some other teaching opportunity. Some of these tips come from books I've read, some are from other people, and some are just my own experimentation. Of course, these tips are not the way to prepare a lesson, they are a way, but I do hope you'll try them and let me know what works for you. This is episode number 9, and it's called Interesting Introductions. What are we talking about today? Well, watch on. Interesting introductions. Introductions really matter. In my personal experience, and listening to many hundreds of sermons, as most of us have if we're preachers and have been in the church a while, my experience is that introductions are often very weak. They usually, quite often, consist of, I'm so-and-so, I've had a good week, I've had a bad week, it's great to see everybody, let's have a look at this passage, and we start to read the scripture. There's very little thought gone into it, and this is a problem for many reasons. And one of them is that you've got a group of people here who are willing to listen to you, or they wouldn't be at church. But they don't yet have a motivation to listen. And if they don't have a motivation to listen, then they're not going to listen very carefully. And if they don't listen very carefully, why have we spent 5, 10, 15 hours preparing a lesson? And so it's vital that we think about the introduction. There's an old proverb which I've adapted a little bit. It goes something like this. People are like donkeys. If you want to get their attention, you've got to grab them by the ears. And there's so much truth in that. If we don't get people's attention at the beginning, we will struggle to get it in our first point, our second point, or in the conclusion, and we may never get their attention. Introductions are crucial. Let's talk first about why we don't pay as much attention as we should to the introduction. Now, the introduction is perhaps the part of the sermon that should be written last. After we've examined the passage, as we've looked at in earlier recordings, after we've understood the point, the core message, developed some points, some illustrations, and some conclusions, then it's time to write the introduction. And because it comes last, it's often neglected. Perhaps we've run out of time. It's a few minutes before we have to dash out and go to church. Sadly, that's often the case. I speak for myself anyway. And the other reason I think we neglect the introduction is because even in our own minds, we do not know what the sermon is about. Now you'd say, well, that's ridiculous. You've spent hours studying the passage and looking at it, and you've got convictions in this passage. You don't know what the sermon's about. No, I think sometimes we don't. We don't have a core message. We haven't done the exercise in one of the earlier recordings about finding the core message, the central point. If we know what the central point is, then we know what our introduction is about, because that's what the introduction is about. In the example of what we've been looking at in Matthew chapter 8, one of the exercises we did, at least for me, I summarized the passage as being about discipleship leading to discovery. If people follow Jesus, they will find out who he is. They will end up in the boat, and in the boat they will experience the storm, and if they experience the storm, they will see him calm the wind and the waves. And they, like the other disciples in the boat, will say, what kind of man is this? They will conclude that they are in the presence of deity in the flesh. Discipleship leads to discovery. It's about, my summary sentence here was, identifying the fears preventing wholehearted discipleship and therefore discovery as to who Jesus is. Now, if I know that that's the central point that I believe is in this passage, and I think God is asking me to get across to the people I'm speaking to, then my introduction is about discipleship. It's about following. It's about discovery. It's about fear. It's about what prevents us. So we would do an introduction on something about fear, something about discovery, and lead people into the passage that way. So the first thing before we write an introduction is to make sure that we know what our central point is. So, what should a good introduction contain? Now, we haven't got time to go into all the possible details in this recording, but the main thing I would suggest is that a good introduction develops and creates tension. Tension, yes. Not anxiety necessarily, or I'm not saying you should have the goal of causing great stress for your congregation, your audience, but nonetheless, some tension is vital. Tension creates attention. Think about films. Films develop tension in the early parts of the plot, and the tension sometimes builds all the way through to the very end, or it builds to a climax at some point in the film and then tails off. But there's always tension and resolution. The same is true of Jesus' own stories, his parables. There is tension. How will these characters work out? What will happen to them? What is the point that Jesus is trying to get across? Where is the laugh in the parable? There are laughs there. There is tension. And the original audience, not having heard them before, would have gasped at certain points, or would have gone, wow, or is that really true? There's tension. Jesus tells these parables, he begins with the setup. This happened, then this happened. There's this son and that son. There's the father. There's the two sons. There's the owner of the vineyard. There's tension. What will happen? Our introductions should create a healthy tension on the theme of, connected with, the theme of the sermon. If the theme of the sermon is fear, then the introduction creates tension around that theme of fear. If the theme of the sermon is discovery, as it might be for Matthew chapter 8, then some tension around the idea of discovery. This is a crucial part of a good introduction that will grab the attention of the listeners. An example of how this could work with our passage in Matthew chapter 8 might be this. If the theme that I pick is discovery, discovering Jesus, discipleship, real discipleship means that we discover who he is, then I might tell at the beginning my own story, prefaced with a phrase like, one of the greatest tragedies of today is the fact that so many people know about Jesus Christ, but so few people really know him, know his miraculous power, know his who he really is as Son of God. I grew up, I went to church, I still didn't know who Jesus was. I read my Bible, I still didn't know who Jesus was. I read Bible notes, I still didn't know. I went to Sunday school, I still didn't know. I went to a Christian youth group, I still didn't know. I could tell that story, and I'm cutting it short here, but I did all these things and I couldn't find him. Where is he? I knew about him, and it wasn't until someone sat down with the Bible and showed me what it meant to be a disciple, to follow, and showed me how to follow by their own example, and then called me to follow Jesus. And I thought, this is what it's about. Then I discovered who Jesus really was. That's one way to get into that, and hopefully it will stir in the people in the audience who've not yet made that decision, or those who made that decision in the past and have drifted from it. It will stir in them a desire to know, what does that really mean, and how will that really work out? And then we look at Matthew chapter 8. Another way to introduce the topic of discovery might be to talk about how amazing it is when we discover things. Or you could talk about some specific things that science has revealed that we didn't know about the universe, about the human body, about the environment around us, about some technical things that are hopefully interesting to do with science. The discovery is exciting. And let's discover some things today about Jesus Christ. Yes, let's go on that quest. It creates some tension. What will we find out today by looking at this passage? That would be another way to create some helpful tension. Another way to introduce the subject of discipleship and discovery might be to talk about our fears. Are we afraid to discover things? You could do a sober kind of introduction and talk about the fact that sometimes people go to the doctor too late. They go there because they're afraid to find out that their symptoms actually do mean something very serious. In that kind of situation, I sometimes talk, because my wife's a doctor, about situations that she has actually known of people who knew they were sick and had many symptoms but did not go to the doctor because they were afraid of what they might discover, and they went too late and then they died, and they could have been saved if they'd gone earlier. That's not a funny introduction, but it will get people's attention. You have to gauge what kind of story or idea to bring across to people in introductions, depending on who you're talking to, the context of the audience you're speaking to and of the passage involved. Another possibility is to use a shock, the shock of discovery, as an illustration. For example, in the introduction, for example, the idea of perhaps you've put on a shoe sometime and found a frog in it, or a toad, or a spider, and that was a shock. That kind of shocking discovery. And what are we going to find out today? As we look into Matthew chapter 8, there were some people who were shocked at what they discovered about Jesus as they followed him. Let's follow their story, that kind of idea. The bottom line of an introduction is that by the time we're done, for example, if I was sitting in the congregation, I should know what the topic of the sermon is, what it's about in its basic form, and I should have a reason to listen to you. It should make me sit up in my chair and say, I'm glad I came today. I want to hear about this. If we can achieve that in 2 minutes, most introductions, 2, maybe 3 minutes, if we can do that, I believe that we'll have the people listening to us, and more importantly, listening to the Word of God for the next 20 or 30 minutes. And they'll get much more out of it if we do an inspiring and interesting introduction. So, there you have it. Interesting introductions. Why not put a little extra effort into preparing the introduction for your next lesson, and let me know how that goes. If you have any other ideas, tips that have helped you or you've heard of, or topics about lesson preparation that you'd like to explore, then drop me an email to malcolm.cox@iccmissions.org and let's see what we can do. Until the next time, I hope you have a tremendous Tuesday and a wonderful week. God bless.